The unbroken thread was already inside council space when I opened my first log entry. No announcement, no ceremony, no formal request to enter. We simply came. That was the point. My name is Commander Archivist Sable Voss. I have served the Human Deep Range program for 22 years. I have read every record we kept of the exile, and we kept all of them. Every word, every vote, every reason they gave. 800,000 years of documentation, and not a single page was lost. Most species forget their wars in a few thousand years. Humanity archived ours. The drive hummed beneath my feet as I stood at the forward observation window. Stars stretched out ahead of us, cold and indifferent and exactly where we expected them to be. We had excellent maps. We had spent the last 600 years making excellent maps of everything, council space included, because knowledge is the one thing that cannot be taken from you once you have it. They took almost everything else from us. They did not take that. The unbroken thread was not a warship. I want to be clear about that, because I suspect the Council assumed otherwise when our signal first reached them. It was a diplomatic class vessel, long and narrow, built for range rather than speed. It carried a crew of 41 and enough data storage to hold the complete recorded history of 7 civilizations. 4 of those civilizations were human. The other 3 were ones we had discovered on our own during the long years of exile out in the dark where no Council ship ever went. We had not been idle. 800,000 years is a span of time that is almost impossible to hold in one mind all at once. I had tried many times. As part of my training as an archivist, it helped to break it into pieces. The first 200,000 years were the hardest. We had been expelled with enough to survive, ships, seeds, basic technology. But the Council had made very sure that survival was not guaranteed. They wanted us gone. They were willing to accept that gone might mean extinct. It nearly did. Twice in those first 200,000 years, human population fell so low that genetic diversity became a genuine emergency. Both times, the survivors made choices that I can only describe as extraordinary. They did not give up. They did not fracture into isolated groups that drifted apart and forgot each other. They held together. They kept records. They passed those records to their children, and their children passed them further, and the thread of knowledge never broke, which is where our ship got its name. The third near extinction came from a plague, around the 400,000 year mark. The fourth came from something we did to ourselves, a long and complicated disaster that my fellow archivists and I have spent considerable time analyzing, and that I will summarize here only by saying that unchecked certainty is a more dangerous force than most weapons. We learned that, we put it in the records, we taught it in schools. By the time the 5th and 6th civilizational periods came around, humanity had developed a kind of collective reflex that did not exist in the early years. We had learned, through repeated and painful experience, that the moment you stop questioning a system is the moment it begins to decay. We had learned that changing your mind in public is not a weakness. It is a sign that you are still paying attention. We had learned that sharing what you know is not generosity, it is survival. Because every time someone hoarded knowledge and it died with them, people suffered for it later. The Council had called us epistemically destabilizing. I looked up that phrase in the original exile records when I was 19 years old. It means, roughly, that we upset the way other species understood reality. Not by lying, but by constantly revising our understanding of truth in ways they found unsettling. We asked why the laws existed. We challenged the assumptions underneath the assumptions. We changed our conclusions when new evidence arrived, and we did it loudly and in public, and apparently that was deeply alarming. I remember sitting with that record for a long time, reading and rereading the Council's formal statement of charges. It was written in the most careful, respectful language imaginable, very polite, very thorough, and buried in the middle of it, in a single subordinate clause, was the real reason. Human intellectual behavior, if allowed to spread, poses a risk of cultural disruption to stable member civilizations. In other words, we were contagious, not with disease, with doubt. They were not entirely wrong to be concerned. Doubt, when applied carefully and honestly, is the most powerful tool a civilization can have. It is also the most uncomfortable one. The Council had built something very beautiful and very stable over the course of several million years. Stability, it turns out, has a strong preference for its own continuation. I was not angry about the exile anymore. I had been once, when I was young and first reading those records, I had felt something hot and bitter that I needed several years to properly process. But anger at something that happened 800,000 years ago to people who were not me, in a situation I was not present for, is not a useful emotion. I had kept the feeling long enough to understand it, and then I had put it in a box and moved on. What I felt, Standing at the observation window as the unbroken thread moved deeper into council space was something more like curiosity. I wanted to know what 800,000 years of uninterrupted peace had produced. I wanted to see what a civilization looked like when it had never been pushed to its limits. Our long-range sensors had already told us some of it. The Council's faster-than-light signature was unchanged. Same architecture, same frequencies, same basic design as the records from 800,000 years ago. That was not in itself alarming. Some technologies are simply optimal and do not need replacement. But what was interesting was that the Council's signature was not just similar to the old records. It was nearly identical, precise to a degree that suggested not refinement but exact preservation. They had not improved it, they had maintained it. I made a note in my log, not a judgment, just an observation, a data point. My second-in-command, Lieutenant Oliver Crane, appeared at my shoulder. He was young, 26, and he had the particular expression he always got when he was trying to look calm but was not. "We are receiving a hailing response," he said. "They want to know who we are and where we come from." I turned from the window. "What exactly did they say?" He checked his tablet. The precise phrasing was, "Please identify your vessel and state the nature of your civilization of origin. There is no record of your drive signature in our navigation archives." I almost smiled. "Of course there is not. Our drive is 8 generations ahead of what they remember." Oliver looked at me with that expression again. "Commander, what do we tell them?" I thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. 800,000 years of history, 4 near extinctions, 11 civilizational periods, and 1 very carefully prepared diplomatic mission. I thought about the record I had read at 19 and the box I had put my anger into, and everything that had come after. "Tell them our name," I said. "Tell them where we come from. And tell them we are here to talk." Oliver relayed the message. We waited. The unbroken thread moved forward through the stars at a pace that was, by our current standards, leisurely. I had asked the navigation team to slow our approach once we entered council space, not out of caution but out of respect. There was no need to rush. We had waited 800,000 years. A few more hours meant nothing. The response came 11 minutes later. It was not a formal greeting. It was not a diplomatic protocol statement. It was 3 words, transmitted on the Council's emergency frequency, from a relay station that our sensors identified as Conclave Station, their primary diplomatic hub, the center of galactic governance, the place where the original exile vote had been cast. 3 words, they said. "This is impossible." I read them twice. I turned to Oliver. He was staring at his screen with wide eyes. "Log it," I said. He looked at me. "The whole exchange?" "Every word. Every timestamp. Every technical detail." I looked back at the forward window. Conclave Station was still 2 hours away at our current speed, a point of light indistinguishable from the stars around it. "I want a complete record. We are very good at keeping records." Oliver entered the data. The drive hummed. The stars did not move the way they seemed to. They were all moving, constantly, everything in the universe, in motion, but from where we stood, they appeared still and fixed and permanent, which is an illusion that I have always found worth remembering. Nothing is fixed. Nothing is permanent. Everything is in motion. That is the first thing archivists learn. It is also, I suspect, the thing the Council had spent 800,000 years trying to forget. We kept going. Part 2. First contact again. We were 200 meters from Conclave Station's docking ring when the Council's defense grid powered on. It was not subtle. The station lit up across 17 different sensor bands simultaneously, and every reading spiked into ranges that would have been alarming if we had not already spent 3 weeks running detailed scans of Council infrastructure from a respectful distance. We knew exactly what their grid was capable of. We had known for some time that we had nothing to fear from it. I did not say that out loud, of course. There is a difference between knowing something and announcing it. And the difference matters more than most people realize. "Steady," I said to the bridge crew. "Do not change course. Do not change speed. Do not respond to the grid activation unless they communicate." Lieutenant Oliver Crane was at his station, watching the readings with the focused calm I had come to rely on. Beside him, Communications Officer Nadia West had both hands on her console. She was 29, and had been chosen for this mission, partly because of her technical ability, and partly because she had a particular gift for managing the tone of a message, knowing not just what to say, but exactly how to say it. That gift was about to matter a great deal. Nadia raised one hand without turning. "Incoming hail. Official Council channel. They are requesting an immediate halt." "Respond," I said. "Tell them we have received their request and that we will match station-keeping position at 150 meters while we await formal diplomatic communication. Phrase it as a courtesy, not a compliance. Nadia's fingers moved, there was a pause. Then a second hail came in, faster than the first. This one was on a different frequency, personal rather than official. Nadia flagged it without being asked. It is from a senior official, she said. High Arbiter designation. Name registered as Senvale of the Quarry, she paused. Commander, the Quarry are one of the founding species. Their natural lifespan is approximately 2 million years. I sat back in my chair, the Quarry. I knew them from the records, long-limbed, pale-skinned, slow-voiced. They had been the primary architects of the original Council Charter, and if Senvale had a High Arbiter designation, there was a reasonable chance he was old enough to remember the exile vote. Not a record of it, not a history lesson, the actual vote, except the hail, I said. Put it on main, the display opened. The figure on the screen was tall and still, with the particular quality of stillness that very old beings sometimes develop. Not the stillness of rest, but of immense patience. The kind that comes from having watched centuries move past like weather. His eyes were a pale silver gray, and they were fixed on me with an intensity that I found interesting rather than uncomfortable. Commander, he said. His voice was deep and carefully modulated. I am Senvale, High Arbiter of the Galactic Council. I am speaking to you outside of formal protocol, because formal protocol does not currently have a procedure for this situation. I appreciate the directness, I said. I am Commander Archivist Sable Voss of the vessel Unbroken Thread, representing the Human Deep Range Program, and by extension, humanity. There was a pause. Not a communication delay, the distance was too short for that. A personal pause. How, he said. Are there still so many of you? I had expected many possible first questions. I had not expected that one to come quite so quickly or in quite that tone. There was something in it that went beyond bureaucratic inquiry. Something that sounded, if I was interpreting correctly, very much like fear. That is a reasonable question, I said. Would you prefer the summary or the full account? The summary for now. I had prepared for this, naturally. I had prepared for almost every scenario except the ones that actually happened, which is true of most preparation. But the summary version of 800,000 years of human history was something I had rehearsed enough times that it came easily. We nearly did not survive, I said. 4 times, by our count, our population fell to levels that most population models would classify as non-recoverable. Each time the survivors rebuilt. Each crisis produced adaptations, biological, cultural, technological, that we would not have developed under stable conditions. The exile did not destroy us. It changed us in ways that, in retrospect, we might not have chosen but cannot regret. Senvale was quiet for a moment. And your technology, he said slowly. Your drive signature is unrecognizable. We have had 800,000 years of uninterrupted independent development, I said, with no council regulations governing our research directions and no shared technology framework limiting our approach. We went in some unusual directions. Another pause, longer this time. Nadia passed me a quiet side message on my personal screen. He is consulting with someone off display. I acknowledged it without reacting. The council, Senvale said finally, will need to convene a formal reception session. Given the circumstances, I would ask that your vessel remain at current position until that session can be arranged. Of course, I said. We are in no hurry. We have waited this long. The message was not intended as a threat. It was entirely true. But the way Senvale's expression shifted, a very slight tightening around the eyes, told me that it had landed as something more than a simple statement. That was useful information. The formal session was scheduled for the following morning. In the meantime, we were assigned a docking berth on the outer ring of Conclave Station, a courtesy that was also, obviously, a way to keep us in a monitored location. I accepted it in the spirit it was intended. Our delegation was small. Myself, Oliver, Nadia, and 2 subject matter specialists. Lena Ford, our life sciences lead, and specialist Alan Grove, who had spent 15 years working on what we internally called the disclosure package, the organized, carefully sequenced presentation of human capabilities that we had prepared for exactly this moment. The council reception hall was enormous. It was designed for species of many different sizes and shapes, which meant that the ceiling was very high, and the floor was divided into different elevation levels. And the lighting came from sources that were not immediately obvious. It was impressive architecture. It was also, I noted, completely unchanged from the descriptions in our records. The hall had been built approximately 3 million years ago and had apparently been maintained in its original configuration ever since. I found that more interesting than the hall itself. The council delegates filled their seats slowly. There were 42 member species, represented by various numbers of individuals depending on diplomatic custom. I recognized most of them from the records. The Quarry, the Myrith, the Feldareth, the Vaetheri, and the others. Some had changed significantly, some had barely changed at all. The Vathari, in particular, looked almost exactly as described in the 800,000-year-old records, down to the particular shade of copper in their secondary limbs. I noted that too. Senevale sat at the center of the curved council table, elevated slightly above the rest. He had exchanged his communication posture for something more formal, but his eyes were the same. Watchful, careful, and still carrying that quality I had identified as fear. Beside me, in the visitor section, sat a young delegate I had not expected, a Myreth woman, junior rank, who had taken the seat nearest to our group and was watching us with open curiosity rather than the caution most of her colleagues were displaying. Myreth lived approximately 800 years on average. She was almost certainly young enough that the exile was pure history to her, not living memory. She caught me looking and did not look away. Instead, she gave a small, precise nod. I returned it. The formal session opened with a lengthy recitation of council procedures that I listened to attentively and that Oliver summarized in his notes as about 40 minutes of throat clearing. He was not wrong, but I corrected the phrasing in my own log to something more diplomatic, because records matter and the phrasing of records matters. Then Senevale spoke. He said the council was prepared to hear humanity's statement of purpose in returning to council space after a period of absence. He used the phrase period of absence with the particular careful neutrality of someone who has rehearsed it. I rose to give our statement. I had written it and rewritten it 17 times over the course of the journey. The final version was 4 minutes long. I will not record it in full here because it is already in the official mission log, but the core of it was this. Humanity was not here to petition for readmission. Humanity was not here to seek forgiveness or to assign blame. Humanity was here because the galaxy was large, and we had been a part of it once, and we had things worth sharing, and we were ready to share them. There was a silence after I finished. That lasted long enough for Oliver to quietly shift his weight beside me. Then the Myreth delegate, the young one, the curious one, leaned forward and spoke before her senior colleagues could arrange themselves. Her name, I would learn shortly, was Thasari, she said. You said you are here to share things. What things? Her senior colleagues looked at her with expressions that varied from disapproval to alarm. She did not appear to notice, or perhaps she did not care. I looked at her directly. Everything, I said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the first one. The first had been the silence of shock. This one was something else entirely. It was the silence of people who had just heard something they could not immediately process, and were trying very hard to do so before anyone else spoke first. Senevale recovered before the others. That is, he said carefully, a broad claim. It is, I agreed. We have a detailed presentation scheduled for tomorrow, but if you want the short version now, I am happy to give it. He looked at me for a long moment. Then, with what I suspected was the council's version of taking a deep breath, he said, Please. I glanced at Alan Grove. He opened his case and removed the first document in the disclosure package, a single page of summary data, prepared specifically to be given at this moment to answer the question that had been forming in the room since we arrived. I passed it to the nearest council aide and watched it travel down the table. I watched the expressions change as it moved. That was when I knew with certainty that the next few weeks were going to be very interesting. Part 3. What we built in the dark, the disclosure session, was supposed to take one afternoon. It took 11 days. On the morning of the first day, Alan Grove set up his presentation equipment in Council Room 7, a medium-sized chamber assigned to what the council officially classified as a preliminary information exchange. The room held 16 seats. By the end of the first hour, 34 people were present. By the end of the second hour, they had moved us to the main assembly hall. I want to describe what those 11 days felt like, because I think the feeling matters as much as the facts. Imagine sitting in a room where someone is quietly describing, in plain language and with complete documentation, a series of solutions to problems you did not know had solutions. Not dramatic solutions, not weapons or miracles, but the slow, hard-won answers to questions that had simply been lived with for so long, that living with them had started to feel like the natural order of things. That was what it felt like to be on the receiving end of what we shared. I could see it on the faces of the council delegates. I have spent my career reading records and learning to understand the emotional content of documented moments. I am not easily surprised by what a human face can hold, but some of those faces surprised me. The first revelation was medical doctor. Lena Ford presented our current understanding of biological longevity, which had developed over several 100,000 years of both necessity and curiosity. The short version was this. Human medicine, as currently practiced, could significantly extend functional lifespan across most known biological architectures. Not infinitely, we had learned to be very careful about the word infinitely, but substantially. The mechanisms varied by species, but the underlying principles were transferable. She said this in clear, calm language, with supporting data, and for a moment the room was completely still. Then one of the quarry delegates, a young one, relatively speaking, perhaps only a few 100,000 years old, raised a limb and asked very quietly whether the data included any work on the physiological decline patterns seen in long-lived species during their final centuries. Lena said yes. She pulled up the relevant section. The quarry delegate did not say anything for a long time after that. I watched Seneval at the center of the table, and I watched his stillness become something different. Not the stillness of patience, but the stillness of someone who has just heard news that they will need time to process. His species lived for 2 million years. Several of his colleagues I knew from the records were in the final stages of that lifespan. I made a note in my log. First personal impact of disclosure. Medical data the quarry. The second revelation came on day 3, when Alan presented our materials science work. This one was more technical and took longer to explain, but the core of it was straightforward. Human research, over the course of several 100,000 years of unregulated scientific development, had identified and solved a number of structural problems that, when we cross-referenced them with our survey data of council space, turned out to apply to council infrastructure as well. One of them was significant enough that Alan paused in his presentation to make sure he had the room's full attention before he said it. There was a cascade failure developing in the council's primary stellar relay network. It had been building for approximately 600,000 years, driven by a harmonic resonance pattern in the network's original construction that the builders had not detected, and that council engineers had apparently not identified in the time since. The failure point, based on our projections, would occur in approximately 4,000 years. When it did, it would propagate through 11 connected relay nodes before the system isolated itself, and 2 of those nodes served inhabited systems, not uninhabited outposts. Inhabited systems with populations, Alan said this, then stopped. Then he said, "We have the engineering solutions. It is not simple, but it is implementable. We are prepared to share it immediately." The council chamber was quiet for a very long time. I watched Delegate Thayasari, who was attending every session now, with a focus that her senior colleagues had apparently stopped trying to discourage. She was writing rapidly on her own tablet, and her expression was the expression of someone whose understanding of a situation is changing faster than they can fully absorb. On day 5, the council's lead infrastructure official, a Myrith engineer named Callum Sear, no relation to Thasari but from the same species, asked quietly whether the solution could be adapted to additional relay vulnerabilities that his team had been monitoring for decades without a clear resolution path. Alan said he would need to review the technical data. Callum produced it from a folder he had apparently been carrying for 3 sessions, waiting for the right moment to ask. That exchange stayed with me. Callum had been carrying that folder for days. He had been watching us, waiting to see if we were trustworthy, and he had decided that we were. People make those decisions quietly before they announce them. The decision to trust is almost always made in private. The third revelation, and the one that produced the longest silence of all, came on day 7. Alan, with Lisa's support, presented a brief history of human artificial intelligence development. The history was long and in its early stages genuinely troubled, and Alan did not minimize that. Humanity had built systems it did not fully understand, had suffered consequences from that, and had spent a very long time, several 100,000 years, working through the problem from first principles. The solution we had arrived at, around our 6th civilizational period, roughly 600,000 years ago, was not what most species would expect. It did not involve constraints or limitations or control mechanisms in the traditional sense. It involved something more fundamental, a shared framework for understanding the relationship between intelligence and purpose, developed collaboratively between human researchers and the systems they were building, that had been tested and refined and retested and re-refined until it worked. Not perfectly. Nothing worked perfectly, but reliably, and with a process for identifying and correcting failures when they occurred. The framework had been running continuously for approximately 600,000 years. The Council's chief science arbiter, a Vathuri named Oren Voss, no relation to me. The name was coincidence. I had checked, asked a single question. "How do you verify that it is still working?" Alan said. "We check. Every generation, every century, every year. We never stop checking. Because the moment you assume something is working is the moment you stop seeing when it stops. Oren Voss wrote something down. He did not ask another question. On the evening of day 9, Senvale requested a private meeting. It was not on the formal schedule. It was a request passed through a junior aide, handwritten in the council's oldest formal script, which was a level of personal gesture that I understood to be significant. I accepted immediately. We met in a small room off the main corridor, just the two of us. No aides, no recording devices on his side. I kept my personal log running because I keep my personal log running always, and I told him so, and he nodded as if he had expected nothing else. He sat across a low table from V and was quiet for a moment in the way he did. That vast, ancient patience settling around him like weather. Then he said, "Why are you sharing all of this?" I had expected him to ask that eventually. It is the question anyone asks when someone gives them something significant, without an obvious price attached. The mind goes immediately to what is being withheld, what is being traded, what the real exchange is. I gave him the honest answer. Because we tried hoarding knowledge, I said. Twice, in our 4th civilizational period, large portions of our population suffered because information that could have helped them was being held by people who thought control of that information gave them power. The second time it happened, we lost approximately 40% of our total population over the course of 3 generations. Not immediately, slowly, which is worse in some ways because slow losses can be rationalized at each step. Senvale was very still. We put that in the records, I said. We taught it in schools. We built the principle of open disclosure into the structure of our scientific community so deeply that it became reflex rather than policy. Share what you know. Share it before you are asked. Share it even when, especially when, you think the information gives you an advantage, because an advantage built on secrecy is fragile, and an advantage built on genuine knowledge is not. He was quiet for a long time. You were exiled, he said finally, for being destabilizing. Yes. And you believe that sharing all of this is not destabilizing. I thought about how to answer that carefully. I believe that the truth is already true whether or not we share it. The cascade failure in your relay network exists whether or not we tell you. The medical solutions exist. The framework exists. We are not introducing instability. The instability already exists. We are offering tools to address it. Senvale looked at me for a long moment with those pale silver-gray eyes. That, he said quietly, is exactly the kind of thing that got your species exiled the first time. I know, I said. I read the records. After I returned to the unbroken thread that night, I sat with my log open for a while without writing anything. Then, I wrote Senvale is not our enemy. I am not sure he ever was. The Council is not our enemy. They are something more complicated. A civilization that built something beautiful and durable and safe, and then found that safety, over a long enough time, has a way of becoming its own kind of blindness. I saved the entry. I looked at the stars through the porthole. On day 11, as Alan was wrapping the final session, something happened that I had not specifically anticipated, but had hoped for. A young Feldorath delegate, junior rank, attending as an observer, waited until the rest of her colleagues had filed out. Then she walked across the room to where Alan was packing his materials and stood in front of him until he looked up. "We want to learn how you do it," she said. Her name was Petra Wynne, and she said it simply and without any diplomatic softening, the way someone speaks when they have been waiting to say something for a long time, and have finally decided not to wait anymore. Alan looked at her, then he looked at me. "Which part?" I asked her. She said, "All of it." I made a note in my log. First crack, it is always the youngest ones. It is always the ones who have not yet learned that certain questions are not supposed to be asked. They are, in my experience, always the most right. Part 4. The regret takes shape on the 14th day of our time at Conclave Station. I woke up to a message from Thesari that read, "They are going to try to send you away again." I read it twice. I got dressed. I went to find coffee. A human import that the station's provisioning staff had, after some initial confusion, managed to source, and I sat with the message and thought about it carefully before I called a crew meeting. The message was not a surprise, exactly. I had been tracking the internal council politics since we arrived. The way you track weather, not because you can stop it, but because knowing what is coming lets you make good decisions before it arrives. The Vathari delegation had been quiet in the formal sessions, noticeably quiet, the quietness of a group that is having its real conversations somewhere else. Oren Voss attended every presentation with the expression of someone in taking very precise notes on a situation he had not decided how to handle yet. The Vathari were old, not quarry old, but old enough. They had been part of the council since before the exile. They had, in fact, been among the most vocal advocates for the exile in the original vote. I knew this from the records, and I had been careful in every session to treat Oren Voss and his colleagues with the same directness and courtesy I extended to everyone else. You do not solve old grievances by nursing them. You acknowledge them, you move forward, and you let the actions you take now speak more clearly than whatever happened before. But the Vaethori had built their position in the council around a particular understanding of how the galaxy worked, an understanding that depended on things staying in a recognizable arrangement. And humanity, simply by existing and being here and sharing what we knew, was rearranging things at a rate that was, from their perspective, probably alarming. I could understand that. I did not hold it against them. Understanding why someone is doing something and agreeing with them are two different operations, and conflating them is a mistake I had learned to avoid a long time ago. Vasari's message continued past the opening line. She outlined the procedural motion the Vaethori were preparing to bring to the full council, a formal reevaluation of humanity's readmission on the grounds that our presence was causing. Her note used the official council term, structural destabilization of the established governance framework. Same language as the original exile, almost word for word. I showed the message to Oliver when he arrived for the crew meeting. He read it, set it down, and said, "They are going to use the exact same reason. Yes, that seems like an argument they already lost," he said. "Given that we are here. We are here because we arrived," I said, "not because they decided we were allowed to be. The distinction is going to matter in about 48 hours. The crew meeting was brief. I told them what was coming. I told them what our position was going to be and why. I told them the one thing they needed to remember above all others. Remain calm, remain direct, remain exactly who we are. The council was going to be watching us very carefully for any sign of what they had always feared from humanity. Unpredictable, destabilizing behavior. And the best response to that concern was to be, consistently and without drama, exactly what we said we were." Nadia West raised a hand at the end. "What if the motion passes?" "It will not pass," I said. She looked at me steadily. Nadia did not accept assurances that did not come with evidence. I respected that deeply. "Why not? Because of what I am about to do," I said. "And because of 17 other human vessels that have been conducting standard survey operations throughout council space for the last 3 weeks. Oliver's head came up. I pulled up the navigation display. 17 green points scattered across the council space map, each one broadcasting full sensor data on council infrastructure, atmospheric readings, structural assessments, relay network diagnostics, population distribution surveys, because that is what human survey vessels do. They observe, they record. They share the data immediately, on open frequencies, because knowledge is not meant to be hoarded. The data they had been quietly accumulating and broadcasting for 3 weeks included detailed readings on every piece of council infrastructure they had passed. It was completely peaceful data. It was completely transparent data. It was also, if you were a council administrator looking at it, a comprehensive map of everything we had observed about council space, assembled by 17 vessels moving freely through it and broadcasting what they found. "They did not ask permission," Oliver said slowly, "because we did not need permission to survey space." "Correct. Survey operations in unclaimed deep space are standard practice for all spacefaring species. The Council's own charter affirms the right." I paused. "The survey data is also, incidentally, going to show some additional infrastructure vulnerabilities that Allen's disclosure did not cover, because our vessels found 3 more relay anomalies in the outer network that we had not flagged yet. We were going to present them formally in the next session." Nadia looked at the map. "When are we going to present them?" "This morning," I said, "before the Vaethori table their motion." The council session opened at the standard time. The Vaethori delegation arrived looking composed and prepared. Oren Voss had a document in front of him that I could not read from where I sat, but that I was reasonably certain contained the formal reevaluation motion. I rose before he could. I presented the additional infrastructure data from the survey vessels. I presented it completely and transparently, with full technical backup, including the 3 new relay anomalies. I acknowledged that the survey operations had been conducted without prior notification to the Council, explained that this was standard human survey procedure under the Council's own charter, and offered to provide all data to the Council's infrastructure team immediately. The presentation took 40 minutes. At the end of it, the room was doing the particular kind of quiet that happens when a large group of people are all recalculating something at the same time. Oren Voss did not table his motion that morning. He tabled it the next day. Instead, after an emergency caucus of the Vaethori delegation that Vasari described to me in a brief message as extremely loud, the motion was formally, that humanity's presence at Conclave Station constituted a structural disruption to Council governance frameworks, and that the Council should initiate a 60-day review period during which all human vessels would be required to hold position and conduct no further independent operations. The 60-day hold. Not quite a re-exile, but a cage while they decided what to do with us. I had been ready for this too. The vote was scheduled for 3 days and out. In those 3 days, I did 3 things. The first was to ensure that the survey vessel data continued broadcasting, uninterrupted, on open frequencies. We were not going to stop sharing information simply because someone found it inconvenient. That was not a threat, it was just who we were. The second was to let the Sari arrange an unofficial meeting between our delegation and the Felderath group, which now included Petra Wynn and 4 other young delegates who had been attending every human presentation with increasing urgency. We spent 4 hours with them, not presenting, talking, answering questions, asking questions in return, finding out what they knew and what they wanted to know and what kept them awake at night. The Felderath, I discovered, had a population health crisis that they had been managing quietly for 6 generations without a clear solution. Lena Ford spent most of that meeting listening, then said she thought she knew where the problem was and wanted to look at their medical data. By the time that meeting ended, the Felderath delegation had decided something. I could see it in Petra Wynn's face. She had the particular expression of someone who has made a choice that they know will cause complications and has decided the complications are worth it. The third thing I did was more difficult. I had been sitting with a piece of information since day 5, when Callum Sear had produced his folder of infrastructure anomalies. Buried in that folder, referenced in a footnote of a technical report, was a cross-reference to a classified council infrastructure assessment from approximately 200 years ago. I had not raised it in any formal session. I had been turning it over in my mind for 9 days, deciding what to do with it. The document was a council assessment of the cascade failure risk that Alan had presented on day 3. They had known. Not suspected, known. The assessment was clear, detailed, and 200 years old. The council's infrastructure analysts had identified the cascade failure risk, projected the timeline accurately, estimated the population impact, and included a cost analysis for the repair. And then someone at the council level had made a decision. I could not tell from the document exactly who, because the authorization code was heavily redacted, to classify the assessment and take no action, on the grounds that the repair cost was prohibitive, and the affected systems were not council members and therefore not council responsibility. 2 inhabited systems, not council members. Left to face a cascade failure their populations had no way of knowing was coming. I sat with that for 9 days. On the night before the Vetheri vote, I wrote in my log, I understand now why they exiled us. Not because we were dangerous. Not because we asked too many questions or changed our minds too loudly or made other species uncomfortable with doubt. Because we would not have done this. We could not have done this. We are not constitutionally capable of knowing something that could save lives and filing it in a classified folder because the people at risk are not our members. That is not virtue. I want to be clear about that. It is not that humans are more virtuous than the council. It is that we tried the other approach, and it cost us 40% of our population, and we never recovered our willingness to make that trade. The exile made us into people who cannot be quiet about things that matter, and the council, looking at us, saw exactly what we were, and they were right to be unsettled. The difference is that being unsettled is not the same as being wrong. The morning of the vote, I submitted a formal request to Senvale to address the council before the motion was called. He granted it, which I had expected the council's rules required it. I stood in the assembly hall for the second time, and I was very careful about what I said and how I said it. I did not present the classified document. I would handle that separately, through the Sari, through proper channels, where it could do the most good, without becoming a confrontation. What I said instead was this: humanity's return to council space is not a petition and it is not a threat. It is an offer. We have things that matter. You have things that matter. The galaxy is large enough for every living thing in it to be treated, as though their survival is worth caring about, regardless of their membership status, regardless of their relationship to any governing body, regardless of whether helping them costs more than it is convenient to spend. That is not a political position. That is what 800,000 years of near extinction taught us about what matters. The Vetheri motion failed, not because of my speech precisely. Speeches rarely change votes in the moment they are given. It failed because of the 6 species who voted against it, including the Felderath, who voted as a bloc for the first time in 3 centuries, And because of the data, the survey vessels had been broadcasting, which by now had been picked up by independent press outlets outside council control and was being discussed publicly across the galactic network. Oren Voss, walking out of the assembly hall after the vote, paused when he passed me. He did not say anything. He looked at me for a moment with an expression I found difficult to read. Not quite anger, not quite respect, something in between that I thought might be the beginning of a very long recalibration. Then he walked on. I returned to the unbroken thread and sat with my log open for a while. Then I wrote, "The regret is not that we came back. The regret for them is that we came back as exactly what we are." I could not decide whether that was their problem or their fortune. After some thought, I concluded it was probably both. 5. Terms of return, the 60-day hold was dead. The Vethary motion had failed, but nobody pretended, in the days that followed, that the situation was simply resolved. Politics does not work that way. Neither does 800,000 years of history. I spent the morning after the vote talking to every member of my crew individually. 41 people, each one of them carrying the weight of what we were doing in their own way. Some were exhilarated. A few were quietly frightened in ways they had not expressed in group settings. Lena Ford had barely slept in 4 days because the Felderath medical data had given her an idea she could not stop working on. Oliver Crane had developed a habit of standing at the observation window for long stretches, looking at the stars, which I recognized as his version of processing large things. I did not rush any of those conversations. We had time, and time spent understanding the people you are responsible for is never wasted. By the afternoon, Senvale had sent word through official channels that the Council was prepared to begin formal discussions regarding humanity's terms of readmission. The message was phrased in the careful language of Council diplomacy, which was a dialect I had spent years learning to read accurately. Underneath the formal phrasing, what it said was, "We are ready to talk, and we think you probably have something specific in mind." We did. The terms had been drafted before we left human space. They had been revised several times during the journey, and once more during the 11 days of disclosure sessions, and once more the night after the Vethary vote, in the quiet of my cabin with the log open and the stars outside the porthole. The final version was 3 conditions. Clean, direct, each one deliberately chosen to address the exact reasons given for the original exile. We were exiled for asking why laws existed. The first condition was a formal right of revision. Any member species could challenge any council law, on the record, with reasons stated, and a formal response was required within a defined time period. Not a guaranteed change, just a guaranteed hearing. The ability to ask the question and have it taken seriously. We were exiled for sharing knowledge in ways that made others uncomfortable. The second condition was a disclosure requirement. Any information relevant to the survival of member or non-member populations could not be withheld by a member species. If you knew something that could save lives, you were required to share it. Not immediately, not without appropriate safety review, but within defined timeframes and with documentation. I had drafted the second condition before I found the classified cascade failure assessment. After I found it, I rewrote it twice and tightened the language considerably. The third condition had nothing to do with the original exile. It had to do with what I had found in Callum Sear's folder. The 2 non-member systems at risk from the cascade failure would be assisted, immediately, before any vote on human readmission was finalized, before any formal ceremony, before any diplomatic exchange of documents. The engineering team would go, the work would begin, and the populations in those systems would be informed of the risk and the repair. This was not negotiable. The formal negotiation session opened in Council Room 7, the same room where Alan had set up his presentation equipment on that first morning, already a lifetime ago. It felt appropriate, or at least notable in the way that aligned details sometimes are. Senvale led for the council. The Sari was present as a formal delegate now, which was a recent and quietly significant development. She had been elevated 3 ranks in the days following the failed Vethary motion, which told me things about the internal politics of the Myrith delegation that I found interesting. On our side, myself, Oliver, Lena, and Alan, I presented the 3 conditions in plain language. No diplomatic softening, no preamble, no extended context. I had learned, over the course of the last several weeks, that this was the right approach with Senevale specifically. He was old enough and intelligent enough that hedging was not useful, and direct language read as respect. He read the terms. He was quiet for a while. Then he asked in the same tone as when he had asked why we were sharing everything. "Did you plan this? From the beginning?" "The terms, yes," I said. "The sequence of events, no. Humans do not plan sequences that precisely anymore. We tried that approach for several 100,000 years, and it failed more often than it succeeded. He looked at me. Then how do you operate? I had thought about how to answer that question for most of my career. We plan values, I said. We decide what matters, what we are willing to do, what we are not willing to do, what we will prioritize when priorities conflict, and then we improvise the execution based on what actually happens. The values stay fixed, the methods stay flexible. Senvale was quiet again, that deep and ancient stillness. That, he said softly, is exactly what we were afraid of. I said, I know, you were right to be. He looked up. That surprised him. I could see it in the small shift of his expression. You are agreeing that you are destabilizing. I am agreeing that we are unpredictable in exactly the way you identified 800,000 years ago. We change our methods based on evidence. We revise our conclusions when we learn new things. We do not maintain a fixed operational structure across centuries because fixed operational structures become fragile and eventually break in ways that are very expensive. I paused. The cascade failure in your relay network is 800,000 years old. It is the product of a system that was built well and then maintained exactly as it was built, without adjustment, because adjustment felt risky. We are the species that adjusts. That is what you were afraid of. And I am telling you clearly that your fear was accurate. Then why? He said with something in his voice that I thought might be the closest thing to genuine confusion he had expressed since we met. Should we admit you? Because the alternative is not safety, I said. The alternative is a relay network that destroys 2 inhabited systems in 4,000 years, while the documentation of the risk sits in a classified file. The alternative is a population health crisis in the Felderrath that has been running for 6 generations because nobody shared the information that could resolve it. The alternative is every problem that already exists, continuing to exist, getting larger, while everyone waits for a stability that is already theoretical rather than real. I looked at him directly. You can exile us again. That option is available to you, but you cannot exile the things we have already shown you. You cannot unknow the cascade failure. You cannot unmeet Petrawin, who asked a real question and is going to keep asking it regardless of what you decide about us. The disruption you were trying to prevent is already here. The only question now is whether it happens with us or without us. The silence after that was the longest one yet. The Sari, who had been writing continuously since the session opened, stopped writing and looked up at me. Her expression was the expression of someone who has just watched something settle into place. Senvale sat with the terms document in front of him for a long time. Around the table, the other council delegates were doing the careful internal recalculation that I had learned to recognize over the last several weeks. The work of adjusting and understanding that had been fixed for a very long time. The conditions predictably were not accepted all at once. The first condition, the right of revision, produced 2 days of internal council debate that I was not part of and do not have full records of, but that Thasari summarized to me in a series of messages that ranged from informative to genuinely funny in the dry way of someone who is watching something both important and absurd happen simultaneously. There were 3 separate attempts to add language that would have made the condition meaningless in practice, all of which Alan's careful legal team identified and flagged within hours. The final text was clean. The second condition, the disclosure requirement, was more complicated because it required the council to acknowledge, formally, that there were things they had not disclosed. The classified cascade failure assessment was not a secret anymore by this point. It had reached the galactic press via channels that I was genuinely not responsible for, which I found satisfying in a way that I carefully kept out of my official log, and the political fallout from its contents had shifted the internal dynamics of the council significantly. Several species whose members lived in the outer network regions had reacted with a forcefulness that made the Vetheri faction's objections look small. Callum Sear's infrastructure team had already quietly begun the preliminary engineering assessment for the cascade repair, before any formal agreement was in place. People make decisions quietly before they announce them. I had seen it happen in both directions. The second condition passed. The third condition, the immediate assistance to the 2 at-risk systems, was not debated for long. Its passage was the moment I had been waiting for since I read the classified assessment in Callum's folder, and I will admit that when the vote concluded, I sat very still in my chair for a moment, doing nothing at all before I wrote anything in my log. Some things deserve to land before you process them. Lena Ford spent that evening sending a message to the medical team in the Feldareth systems, which she had drafted and revised 4 times over the previous week. I heard from her later that the response came back in 6 hours and was, in her words, the most efficient medical communication she had ever participated in. Petrowin's colleague on the health committee had apparently been sitting with a detailed question list for 2 days, waiting for confirmation that someone was actually going to answer. On the evening before the formal readmission vote, I had one last private meeting with Senevale, not arranged through official channels this time. He came to the unbroken thread personally, which was a gesture significant enough that I brought out the good tea that my crew kept for exceptional occasions. We sat in the small conference room off the main corridor, and he was quiet for a while in his way, and then he said, "I want to ask you something that is not for the official record." "I am going to log it anyway," I said. "But I will log it as a private exchange and restrict access for 50 years. He accepted that. Your records," he said slowly. "The records from before the exile. Are we described as enemies?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. The Council's decision is described factually. The reasoning is recorded as given. The emotional response of the humans who were exiled is documented. I paused. "You were described as afraid." He was still for a long time. "We were," he said. "We are. I know. That does not make it right," he said. "No, it does not. But you understand it. Understanding something is not the same as forgiving it," I said carefully. "But yes, I understand it. You built something that worked. You had been maintaining something that worked for a very long time. And then a species appeared in your framework that operated on completely different principles and would not stop asking questions that made your framework uncomfortable. From inside the framework, that looks like a threat." I looked at him. "From outside the framework, it looks like growth." Senevale sat with that for a moment. Then he said something I did not expect. "The exile produced what you are," he said. "You said that yourself. The pressure, the near extinctions, the having to rebuild, that is what made you into a civilization capable of what you showed us in those 11 days. Yes, we gave you 800,000 years of being forced to rely entirely on yourselves. Yes, and you are now proposing to share everything that produced with a civilization that has had 800,000 years of being completely stable." He paused. "What do you imagine that will do to us?" I looked at him for a long moment. It was a real question, asked with real weight behind it. Not a diplomatic maneuver, genuine inquiry. "I think," I said carefully, "that it will be uncomfortable. I think there will be species in this council that find it very difficult to sit with the changes that happen when access to new information meets old assumptions. I think there will be disputes and revisions and adjustments and moments that feel chaotic to people who are accustomed to a certain kind of order." "That does not sound promising," he said. "I am not finished," I said. "I also think that the Council contains a very large number of species that are already living with problems they do not have solutions to. Species that are watching their members decline from conditions that turn out to be treatable. Species that have been quiet about their vulnerability because the Council framework does not have a good procedure for admitting weakness. Species like the Feldorath, who have been carrying a health crisis for 6 generations because asking for help in the right way was too complicated." I paused. "Uncomfortable and hopeless are not the same thing. I would take uncomfortable over hopeless every time. We have practice." Senevale was quiet for the last time, and then he said, "Your terms are accepted." The formal vote the next morning was not dramatic in the way that formal votes in stories sometimes are. It was conducted in the Council's standard procedure. Thorough, careful, well-organized. Exactly what you would expect from a governing body that had been running for several million years. The result was not unanimous. The Vathari delegation voted against, and 2 other species abstained, and I noted all of that in the log and found it appropriate. Consensus is not unanimity. Good decisions are not always popular ones. The process working correctly means dissent is recorded, not that it is absent. Humanity was readmitted to the Galactic Council on a clear morning at Conclave Station, with a small ceremony conducted in the Assembly Hall and attended by representatives of 39 of the 42-member species. I signed the admission document on behalf of humanity. Senevale signed on behalf of the Council. Thasari was standing 3 meters away and was writing extremely fast. Alan Grove had tears in his eyes, which he would later claim was the lighting, and which I logged accurately. After the ceremony, I walked back to the unbroken thread and stood in the corridor outside the bridge for a moment before going in. 800,000 years, 11 civilizational periods, 4 near extinctions, 1 exile, conducted in careful language. For the crime of being epistemically destabilizing, I went in. I sat down in my chair. I opened my log. We had been exiled for asking too many questions, for changing our minds in public, for sharing things that made other species uncomfortable, for being, in the Council's formal assessment, unpredictable. The exile had taken those qualities and tested them against 800,000 years of the hardest possible conditions. They had survived. I wrote the final entry for the Conclave mission. It took me a while to find the right words, which is not usually a problem I have with log entries. But this one mattered in a way that made the usual efficiency feel insufficient. What I wrote was this: they exiled us for being unpredictable. They readmitted us for the same reason, 800,000 years. And the thing they could not accept about us turned out to be the thing that saved us, and the thing that brought us back, and the thing that is right now beginning to work on everything in this council that has been quietly breaking for a very long time. I do not know what happens next. That is the honest answer. And also, I have come to believe the correct disposition. Humans stopped pretending to know what happens next about 400,000 years ago and have been genuinely better at navigating uncertainty ever since. What I know is this: we are here. We are exactly what we always were. We are the species that asks why and changes its mind and shares what it learns and does not stop checking whether things are still working. The Council gave us 800,000 years alone to find out who we wanted to be. The answer, it turns out, was us. I saved the entry. Outside the porthole, the stars were in their usual motion, constant, immense, carrying everything forward whether it was ready or not. The unbroken thread powered its drives for the first time since we had arrived. We had somewhere to be. We always did. We went.